The Senedd Sources podcast is proud to be sponsored by Electrify Britain. So much of Wales's history is built around energy, where we live, the jobs our parents and grandparents did, the enormous Welsh contribution to powering the war efforts in the 1930s and 40s. Our stories bound up with meeting the country's energy needs. But it's not just our past, it's part of who we are today. We are turning the wind on our hills, the tides of the Severn, and the solar panels on our rooftops into cleaner, secure and affordable energy for good. Wales already produces more electricity than we ourselves use, quite a remarkable achievement. And by 2035, renewable electricity generated in Wales could meet all of Wales's needs many times over. Benefits from Wales's clean energy should flow into every household and every community, getting bills down and keeping them down. So what's stopping that? The truth is that the way we charge for electricity is stacked against us. Too few of us are able to access it directly. Electricity bills are higher than they should be, while gas is artificially cheap. Electrify Britain believes Wales's clean energy dividend should flow into every home and every community. We're campaigning for cheaper electricity bills and faster access to modern electric technologies so families can enjoy warmer homes, cheaper travel and real savings on bills. So the clean power made in Wales powers Wales. Clean power made in Wales should power Wales's future, and Electrify Britain is here to make sure it does. Follow at Electrify Britain to find out more. Hello and welcome to the Senedd Sources podcast, where we take you inside Welsh politics. I'm Ollie Cole, and also on the podcast, Joe Kiernan, former political advisor to a couple of First Ministers, and before that, a journalist as well. Hello, Joe.
Hi, Ollie. How's it going?
All very good, thank you very much. And also with us, Craig Lawton, who is a politician and advisor to the Welsh Conservatives, now at Grasshopper Comms. Hello, Craig.
Hi, Ollie. How's it going?
All good. So on the podcast today, with threats from the left and right, can Labour cling on? Are parties helped or hindered by their UK counterparts? And do we even need more politicians? But first, what is this podcast all about, and who the heck are you listening to? So, Joe, I mentioned you were an advisor to a couple of First Ministers. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I got into that from being a political journalist for a long time in telly and radio, and got a phone call one day completely out of the blue from the then First Minister, Rhodri Morgan, asking me to go in and be a special advisor for him. And the relevance of that really was that there are shades of what we're facing today here in Wales. It was 2006. The polls, such as we had back then, were looking fairly grim. You've got to remember that this is in the framework of Labour dominance for 100 years, and actually sailing through those early Senedd, or as they were then, Assembly elections. So I remember him saying to me, "I need you. I want you to come in. We're facing real problems, but it might be a job that only lasts 8 months because you might be sort of like kicked out next May." As it happens, we did better than predicted. I'd like to think I had a little hand in that. And I went on to see Rhodri through the rest of his term and then worked for Cadwyn Jones afterwards. After 10 years, frankly, I was on my knees and thought, time to give something else a go.
That sounds like a good idea. You've had no temptation to go back in?
No, I remember Cadwyn Jones saying to me when I was adamant that I was going, so much so that I actually booked a very long haul flight to go away for 3 months so he couldn't tempt me to come back in. And he was saying, but stand. It's never been something that's been a priority for me. And I think particularly as a woman, but in reflecting over the last 8 or 9 years since I left government, the rise of social media, the negativity, and just the sheer nastiness of some of the interaction has just firmly cemented that I made the right decision there.
Well, and it means that you can come on this podcast a lot, which is
Indeed.
more the better. Craig, you have done the bit at the front as well as the bit at the back. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sounds like actually I've got a very similar experience to Joe in some ways. So I started off working in the legal profession, actually. That was what I was going to do. And then a vacancy came up with a Conservative regional member of the Senedd. And I thought, it looks interesting. I'll have a go at that if I can. I thought maybe I'll do that for 6 months. 7 years later, I was still there. through a Welsh Conservative leadership contest, which unfortunately we weren't successful in, through a couple of elections and various other things. And before I then moved on to work as a public affairs advisor in-house with a trade union. That was a medical trade union. March 2020, everything went out the window as we knew it. Everything got turned on its head. I remember having a sit-down meeting face-to-face with the health minister in sort of mid-January 2020, as it was, Welsh Government Health Minister in Cathays Park. And then a couple of weeks later, suddenly everything was on Zoom and we were trying to work out what was happening. And just at the point that you really wanted to have that face-to-face interaction with politicians, see the whites of their eyes, understand what they were doing, get your message across, it was really difficult to do that. And I think we learned an awful lot in that 2 years about how we reinvent political engagement, for want of a better phrase, and what's a priority as well, and how do we engage and everything like that. So that all sort of happened very, very quickly. A couple of years ago, I was asked to join Grasshopper as their head of public affairs. I've been doing that for 2.5 years now.
Very nice. Also interesting you say about the pandemic. It also sort of showed, I guess, voters what the Welsh government can and can't do more than anything else ever has, really.
Yeah, 100%. There was a lot of uncertainty and people just didn't understand what devolution was in Wales and outside of Wales. And it was really interesting that I'd have people in England saying to me, we've seen someone called Mark Drakeford on the TV. And I was thinking, how do you not know that this is a thing? It's always weird because everyone seems to understand devolution in Scotland and they know that there is a Scottish government. They know there's a First Minister. And yet it took a global pandemic for us to get to the same situation in Wales. And that was the same with a lot of Welsh voters, I think, as well.
Campaigning in the election after COVID, it was very clear that punters on the doorstep knew what were the responsibilities of the Welsh government as opposed to Westminster much, much more clearly.
Totally. I'll give you a comparison, though. So I remember being a candidate back in 2016 for the Senedd election, running in Swansea West. And we were knocking on doors sort of mid-March time. And people were like, what's the as it was Welsh Assembly? What's the Welsh Assembly? What is that? What does it mean? There are no council elections coming up. Why are you knocking doors? And then suddenly David Cameron announced the referendum for the EU. I knocked a door the next day and I said to someone, how are you thinking of voting? And they went, I'm going to vote leave. And I was thinking, no. I don't mean that one. I mean the important one that's coming up first before the referendum. And it just demonstrated straight away that people didn't know what was happening on a devolved level. But when it came to national politics and national media, that just grabs the attention straight away.
That's only one of David Cameron's many sins in my book, Craig.
There was numerous elections I've been involved with where, and I'm sure it's the same for Labour candidates as well, where something comes out from the centre in London without any thought for what it actually means in the battleground constituencies a long way away in devolved nations. It seems to be.
Well, I'll tell you a very, very quick story. I was working for Cadwyn Jones as senior special advisor and was in Downing Street for a meeting with David Cameron and George Osborne. And this whole issue of date of Brexit referendum came up. And he said, I'm minded to have it then. And we were like, you just can't. How can you expect everyone in Wales, all of the progressive parties to coalesce around campaigning for a Remain vote when we've also got to fight an election? And that's exactly what happened. He wouldn't budge on it. He said, it'll be fine, we're going to win anyway. Yeah, famous last words. But we had to switch from fighting an election here in Wales. There were only weeks. You were trying to sort of get a government sorted out. There is no way that the sort of firepower of campaigning on the Brexit referendum could come together in time. It was a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, that voter was just very politely asking Craig to leave his own doorstep, I think. But, it's very nice. I remember being on the radio when David Cameron actually had to announce that, we were leaving the EU and he was standing down. And it was a really, really weird atmosphere because everyone sort of in the early hours woke up wondering what had gone on and what that meant for Wales. And you also saw, well, like you say, Craig and Joe, the sort of like blended picture of how Welsh politics integrates with Westminster politics and everyone sort of going, hang on, there's a few things going on here and we're not actually sure what's quite happened. And a lot of political advisors and people I was talking to sort of unsure how everything had gone the way it had gone and what that actually meant for Wales as well. So it was quite the moment. To answer a question from listeners and from Craig and Joe, which is who the heck am I? I am Ollie. I've been on the radio for the best part of a decade and a half now. Started out at Radio Pembrokeshire, Radio Ceredigion, Radio Carmarthenshire, all of those local stations, covering Welsh politics right the way through, and then headed to Westminster after that, where I've sort of watched Welsh politics, and whenever anything Welsh politics pops up, I sort of am hooked to the TV, whether I should be covering it or not. So that meant that when before guessing, Welsh Labour went through a fair few First Ministers pretty rapidly, I remember just being sort of sat watching it non-stop. Let's take us to today and where we are. We are just over a couple of 100 days away from, I would say, probably the most consequential election that Cardiff Bay has seen since the National Assembly was created. Potentially could be that when we wake up after polling day. It might be the first time that Wales might not be led by a Welsh Labour First Minister. We're seeing the rise of reform. We're seeing the potential of the Welsh Conservatives sort of not being really in the picture, and, Plaid Cymru as well, and the independence vote trying to pick up parts on the left where people think that the Westminster Labour Party has sort of let them down. So it is all to play for this far out. And if you look at the polls, that is exactly what you see. You see Plaid Cymru and Reform neck and neck, Labour a little bit behind. And Joe, you were saying just a little bit earlier about coming in under Rhodri Morgan and a very, very sort of unsure picture of where things were going to go. How close do you think we are now to then, and how different, is the actual playing field that Welsh Labour have to play?
I was thinking back to that 2007 election. The polls, they were nowhere near as sophisticated as we've got now, but they were showing we would lose a significant number of seats. I would distinctly remember having conversations with Rhodri Morgan about how bad it had to get before he'd resigned, for example. We ended up in coalition territory. And I mention that because, of course, because we've got this new larger Senedd and 96 members instead of 60, new voting system, it means that coalitions going forward are going to be absolutely inevitable. The difference, though, with now is just the sheer force of the reform surge. It's a surge that's not made on the back of really specific policies or a vision for the future. It is just a plague on all your houses feeling that punters are really a bit fed up. More than a bit fed up, I'm being polite. But, they want to give a bloody nose to Labour and the Tories in particular. And actually trying to think how you can stop that is really difficult. I think they're going to leave all of their policy platform, announcing candidates, etc., until the last minute, really, or as late on as they can, because it means they can avoid scrutiny in a way that Labour, Plaid Cymru and the other parties in Wales can't do at the moment. I think it's a real shock to the system. You said that, there's all to play for. I kind of think Labour being on 14%, unless there's something that changes the mix up, it's really difficult to see how we can kind of move forward with any kind of momentum.
And Craig, let's just talk about the sort of right part of that vote. So that we'll get into a little bit whether Reform in Wales is actually a sort of classically right or left-wing party, I suppose, in its pitch to voters in a little bit. But I was at Reform Conference a couple of weeks ago, Reform UK Conference, and there was a lot of emphasis on the Westminster election, a lot of emphasis on Scotland, but not really much of a mention about Wales. And their sort of rise just seems to be coming out of sort of pockets of Facebook groups, what Nigel Farage is saying in London, without anything to hook onto. And the Welsh Conservatives sort of don't know how to handle that either, neither does Welsh Labour. What do you make of what's happening on the right of that vote?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Joe said at the start, really. People are just really annoyed and they're sick of politics. And I think they look at all the parties in the Senedd, whether they agree with the Senedd or not, they just look at all of those parties as the status quo, for want of a better phrase. The Conservatives are in a really difficult position. Darren Miller, the current leader of the Conservatives, took over not too long ago. He's worked his hardest to try and build some profile as leader, and he is opposing Welsh government and Welsh Labour. But despite all of that opposition, Reform are still pointing out that the Conservatives aren't really the opposition. It wasn't that long ago that they were in government. So Reform are in a perfect position. They can point to Labour as being, in their words, the ones that are failing now, and they can point to the Conservatives as being the ones that failed not too long ago.
And also, you've got to add in the Plaid Cymru thing there as well too, Craig, I guess, is that, Plaid Cymru members are the ones that will not vote for Reform. They're taking Labour votes. The polling we had most recently, the Plaid Cymru poll, showed that a lot of Labour voters are lending their vote, if you like, to Plaid Cymru. A smaller number are switching to Reform. But I think that the other interesting thing it showed is that a lot of the Reform base is made up from people who haven't voted, haven't had a tendency, a habit to vote in the past. So it's going to be really crucial to see whether they actually come out and go to the polling stations next May. And that's why the polls are a tiny bit predictable. We can kind of think Reform are on 29, 30%. But it's going to be fascinating to see whether they can make people go out. And you're right, Ollie, about kind of like, Facebook groups, etc. Just in my work with Cavendish Cymru, we're doing some polling for a client at the moment. We've been doing some social ads for that. And the pile-on, and it's obviously orchestrated. This is not organic. People have been told to put comments on certain social media posts and ads, for example. They're using that very, very successfully at the moment.
And it goes back to something, the sort of left and right dynamic of politics, because a lot of what's really interesting is that Reform, if you look at their national policies, they want to spend a lot of money. They are not what you would call a sort of Margaret Thatcher type, fiscal conservative party. And if you look at what they're saying in Wales, and when they launched their Westminster campaign in Wales a couple of years ago, they were talking about reopening the mines and things like that, and actually sort of harking back to a sort of an era of Wales that really doesn't exist anymore, but people sort of look through rose-tinted glasses at. And so how do you counter that, Joe? I mean, if you're advising a Labour, First Minister, and you say, look, these people, what they want is to go back to what were traditional Labour values in, the values in energy, in industry, but that's not coming from Labour, or they can't see it coming from Labour. What do you even do about that?
It's really hard, because that rose-tinted glasses phrase is really key. We can't go back to those times. Things have changed. The notion that people in Wales want to send their kids and grandkids back down the mines is baloney. It's absolute nonsense. The number of people who lost loved ones during the time when the mines were open. And of course, I was born in the year of Aberfan. My mum remembers it absolutely, where she was and how she felt at that time. We don't want to go back there. I'm sorry. But I think where the other parties are missing a trick, and particularly Labour, is that we've got a managerial Prime Minister. He's dull. He's boring. He's managing. There's no vision. We haven't come to know him personally. And we've got a First Minister in Wales who does have more personality. But on either side of the M4, I don't think we've got a strong enough vision of their plans for the future. What are they offering people in terms of hope? What are they saying to those people who are really feeling the pinch in their pocket with cost of living, etc.? What about those parents who are worried about job prospects, education for their kids going forward? And until we have got that narrative, that vision, and I'm really hoping a couple of heads get knocked together and some kind of plan is put together, because frankly, it's desperately, desperately needed. And if you think about all of the activists, we've had quite a lot of council by-elections within a stone's throw of Cardiff recently. We've got the Caerphilly by-election coming up. You've got these activists knocking on the door. What are they meant to say to people? And how can they counter the huge number of people who are just saying, we hate you, we think you're useless, you've got nothing to offer, I'm voting Reform this time. Give them something to sell on those doorsteps.
And that's something, Craig, that Plaid Cymru are also able to, in a way, exploit, right? The people who will reject the norm, who will reject Reform as well, but they've got a leader. I mean, people seem to like Rhiannon West when he's on the television, in the same way that I remember, when it came to national debates years ago, people right across the UK seemed to go, how can I vote for Leanne Wood? And the answer came there, none. But they seem to have tapped into something there in terms of personality, in terms of mood that they can jump onto that, Welsh Labour and the Welsh Conservatives sort of can't.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So under the old Senedd voting system, it was always said that Plaid Cymru was, in essence, pretty much everybody's second favourite party. So you obviously got to vote in a constituency, and then you got to vote in a regional area as well. And so a lot of Labour voters would ultimately use that secondary vote in the region for Plaid Cymru, knowing that a regional vote in a strong Labour constituency would be wasted. And so Labour voters are used to, for want of a better phrase, choosing to vote Plaid Cymru. And I think it's interesting that Rhiannon West has essentially ruled out a independence referendum in the first term of a Plaid Cymru government. I think it's a very shrewd move. I've had a few people from Plaid Cymru say to me, oh, it's awful because he's going to lose loads of his grassroots support. I disagree with that entirely.
Yeah.
I think it's a really shrewd move because ultimately, Plaid Cymru have never been in government before, and Plaid Cymru supporters wants to see them in government. But actually, the biggest turn-off for a lot of potential Plaid Cymru voters would be that independence question. And so essentially ruling it out for the first 4 years is a really shrewd move when it comes to essentially having that dialogue with potential voters and looking at what else Plaid Cymru stands for. I think too many people still assume they are a single interest party or a bi-interest party. If you look at Welsh language and independence, they're certainly not. And this ultimately gives them the opportunity to explore those other policy areas. And I think if you look at rural Wales, Plaid Cymru are very different to how they are in urban areas as well. I would say that they are quite conservative with a small c, not right-leaning, but they're quite conservative in rural areas.
They're very conservative.
Well, yeah. Okay, that's you only have to look at Plaid's position when it comes to renewable energy. They're very pro-renewable energy, but they're very concerned about the impact it has on local rural areas, cables, whether they go underground or overground, the visual impact it has.
Farming.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, farming. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, it's a real opportunity for Plaid to reach out to everybody that wants to oppose reform, for want of a better phrase, and to also look to see how far they can really build that base.
They have just gone through all of their policy platform. They are so far advanced compared with any other party in Wales in terms of their manifesto preparations. They know their policy platform. When the polls started rising, it was a bit of a kind of, we might actually be in government. And they are now going through everything with a fine-tooth comb to make sure it's deliverable, it's affordable. Anything that might scare the horses has been culled. They are not wanting to do anything to damage this chance of being in government. And they have been in government before, in the coalition in 2007 as junior parties. But you're right, Craig, this is their chance to have a Plaid First Minister. I know from conversations on policy agendas that I've been having that there are some things that they firmly support, but are absolutely not going to talk about and refusing to talk about because it might damage some of the votes that they get in. Can't blame them at all.
Earlier, we asked if Wales is generating more clean electricity than we use, why aren't we all feeling the benefit? Well, right now, the way our system is structured means people can't easily use the cleaner, homegrown energy Wales is already producing. Households still face high electricity costs, while many can't access the dividend that exists today. It's simply too difficult to tap into. The opportunity in front of us is huge. By 2035, Wales's renewable generation capacity could meet all of our needs many times over. That's more than enough power to light every home, every business and every community across the nation. Electrify Britain is campaigning to make sure that dividend pays out here in Wales. That means lowering electricity prices, supporting smarter tariffs and making it easier for households and communities to benefit from the clean energy already being generated. The more we electrify, the more that clean energy dividend flows back into Welsh households in lower bills, stronger communities and a fairer, more secure future.
Let's sort of take part of that conversation and also a bit of what Craig heard on the doorstep over the Brexit referendum and just chat quickly about how much influence sort of Westminster will have over the Welsh parties and Welsh voters. Because, Joe, you were mentioning how Keir Starmer's been a bit of a damp squid for Welsh Labour voters. And we've also seen what we really saw in the run-up to the general election was a lot of, quite popular Welsh Labour politicians booted out of their seats to make way for some more friendly politicians who've since gone in different directions. But, Craig, you've also got how much impact Nigel Farage is going to have compared to whether there's any sort of actual local structure greater than a few sort of meetings in a pub for reform. How much Kemi Badenoch really cares about Wales as well in terms of the Welsh Conservatives. So let's start with... let's start with Nigel Farage. Do you think in Wales more than anywhere else, Craig, Farage is reform still at the minute?
Totally. I think you only have to see the way that they launched their by-election campaign in Caerphilly. You had these shutters opening and there was only two people front and centre, Clear, the candidate, and Nigel Farage, and everything has been about Nigel Farage. I think they've done that intentionally by not selecting candidates, by not announcing who is really writing their manifesto as such, because it means that everything is Nigel Farage. And it means that everything he does nationally is seen and is picked up in Wales as well. Reform are going to be interested in Wales because it gives them ultimately the first opportunity to get a real foothold in a parliament, whether that is in government or in opposition. And I suspect that they are hoping they win the popular vote and then do not end up in government, because it gives Nigel Farage the opportunity to stand on a national platform across the whole of the UK and say, despite getting the most votes, we have been denied government. The only way you can ensure a reform government at the next general election is to give us an outright majority. And that will be his campaign for the following 2.5, 3 years, I imagine.
Agree with that entirely.
The general election, everything sort of went perfectly for the Labour Party right up until the end, where they ended up actually in government and having to actually do stuff, which is the sort of the actual problem of politics, is right at the end of it when you're all celebrating. The next day, you've actually got to start doing stuff. And that's affected what's going to happen to Labour in this Senate election as well, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, difference, I guess, is that, Keir Starmer went into the election wanting to govern. And I think that Craig is right that Reform, Nigel Farage don't want to govern. And it's interesting that you said, Ollie, that Wales didn't come up much at the Reform conference recently, because he said in broadcast interviews here, Nigel Farage, that he very much sees the Welsh elections, as his stepping stone to Westminster. They're putting shed loads of money in. You're not seeing it in the traditional. They're not like Labour or Plaid, who are outdoor knocking every evening at the moment, or, it's all being done online and they've got vast amounts of money to spend. Going back to your question, though, what happens at Westminster really, really impacts the outcomes of the election here for Welsh Labour. Keir isn't doing well. We've got the whole sort of leadership stuff going on at the moment, questions about whether he'll be there for much longer. Andy Burnham, who I admire hugely, think he's done wonderful things, but frankly needs to put up or shut up, because divided parties don't win elections. And you've got poor Lyned trying to sell a vision here in Wales, and it is completely distracting. And it's great fodder for reform. It's great fodder for Plaid Cymru. And the thing that's on the horizon, which is going to be hugely impactful, is the budget. we're reading stuff in the newspapers about, more tax rises needed, the state of the economy. Frankly, if we have significant tax rises in that, then 14% that Labour are on at the minute in the polls may seem rather good. Thank you very much. Because those voters who are choosing now to switch to Reform are not going to come back to Labour unless there are some goodies up for grabs after that budget.
But this is always the problem, isn't it, with Senedd elections generally, actually. They always end up falling in the middle of a government term. For the last few years, they worked quite well for Welsh Labour because it meant they could point at the, quote, awful things that the Conservatives were doing in London and how you need to make sure you have a strong Labour government at the other end of the M4. Now it's on the shoe is on the other foot, unfortunately, and Reform are capitalising on that because they have no one else to look to. No one else is filling that void, ultimately.
So let me tell you a little secret, Craig. It is always much harder as Welsh Labour to fight an election here in Wales when you've got a Labour government the other end of the M4. It was the same in Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's time, I can assure you.
Yeah, 100%.
And talking about divided parties, Craig, the Conservatives, does Kemi Bain not care about Wales?
That's a good question. I think she cares. I've only met Kemi Badenoch a couple of times, so I'm not going to pretend I know.
Well, that might be an answer, I suppose.
She came to the Welsh Conservative Conference, and you could say, well, that's the minimum you would expect. Well, that's pretty much you get from all national leaders. So it's hard to make a comparison in that sense. I know that the Conservative leadership in Wales are pushing for her to come to things. We saw her come to the Royal Welsh Show, and I think they're trying to make clear that it isn't just about her either. So we've seen Mims Davis in her role as Shadow Secretary of State coming to Wales as well. Again, they're trying where they can to demonstrate that they are a united front and one team. But the team's pretty small in comparison. I mean, you only have to look at the fact that there's not really anybody to choose from when it comes to a Shadow Secretary of State role. It's pretty difficult when your Shadow Secretary of State is based just outside of London, essentially. It makes it quite hard.
Yeah, and there's also been a bit of a scuffle within the party about whether the Conservatives sort of like the Senedd at all. Right? There's been people kicked out for not wanting the Assembly to carry on, and this, that, and the other. So sort of actually going into this election, there's been a bit of scrappy sort of thoughts of what the platform's actually going to be for the Conservatives.
Oh, this has been a constant thing for as long as I was involved with the Conservatives. While I was a member, while I was a candidate, there was always this discussion. And I would say, some people will say that I'm wrong or they'll disagree with me. But the feeling has always been that while the group in the Senedd will say that the party is pro-devolution and that it's not the Senedd that's bad, it's the government that's in charge of it at this time that needs to change. The membership on the whole still is pretty anti-devolution, I would say. You only have to look when it comes to selection meetings, in my experience, wherever you speak in a way that isn't entirely negative about devolution, you kind of see a few rolled eyes in the audience and a few tuts, which is always frustrating, I would say. The party has always been split between the membership and the members to one of a better extent, I would say.
Joe, do we need more politicians? Because this is going to be a very different type of election than the Senedd has seen before, both in terms of where the polling's at, but in terms of who are actually returning and how, isn't it?
Yeah, and, from a Labour perspective, that's been exacerbated by half of the group. And, the most experienced, the sheer number of former ministers and existing ministers, actually, who are going to be standing down next May. Look, there's been a discussion for as long as I can remember about needing a larger Senedd, more members. The amount of work that members have to do being a 60-member Senedd is quite ridiculous. When you take out that chunk of 15, 16 people who have government jobs, you haven't got very many left to do all of the committee work, the scrutiny. So there's a valid argument, I think, about improved scrutiny holding government to account, whatever colour that might be. I think the timing of this is really unfortunate. I think when things are so tough for the general public, that reform are going to make the most of the extra cost, etc. And we heard that the cost has gone up from the estimates when the legislation were going through. And on a political front, I think it's be careful what you wish for. There are a lot of Labour members who are not very happy with the former First Minister, Mark Drakeford, currently the Finance Minister, who was behind this because, frankly, under this system, Labour are likely to do worse, perhaps, than they might have done under the old system. I mean, I think that's a fine line, frankly, given where the polling is at the moment. It's what we've got and we need to make it work. And I think that the progressive parties and, the Welsh Conservatives need to show that we can be better at scrutinising, holding to account. I think the reality, if we have a large reform opposition in the Senedd, is going to be very, very different. And it's really hard to predict just how easy it will be to get legislation and budgets, etc., through if the numbers are very, very tight.
We've got nothing to compare it to, have we, really? The best comparison we've got is UKIP when they were in the European Parliament and UKIP when they were in the Senedd. It's fair to say, though, that a lot of the people behind the scenes in Reform UK were actually very similar to the people that were involved at one stage or another with UKIP in Wales. So they will remember what happened when they got elected in 2016 with whatever it was, 8 or 9 MSs, and how quickly they all fell out and it all fell apart. I've not heard this at all. This is just my presumption. But I would be amazed if the leadership and the people behind the scenes in Reform UK are not very alive to that issue and are not going to be working really hard to make sure that the same does not happen again, because they've seen it firsthand.
But it's really, really hard, isn't it? Because you have a lot of people who've not been used to being party members of any party, coming from very disparate backgrounds, etc. And as you say, I think it took 6 months for us to have the majority of the UKIP group sitting as independents and absolutely loathing each other when they got elected previously. I think the other issues reform, which they really need to sort out, and I can understand entirely why Nigel Farage doesn't want to, but is having a party leader in Wales. I note this morning that Nathan Gill, the former Reform Wales leader, has pleaded guilty to taking money for making supportive statements about Russia when he was an MEP. They can't continue to only have Nigel Farage. Well, they can. But what happens when we get to the sort of the short campaign? We've had broadcast companies saying they won't use Farage on their panel discussions. Quite rightly too. If he's not going to be the next FM, he shouldn't be on them. But who is going to be on them? And actually, I think getting some recognition and setting out a stall with whoever that person is going to be in enough time before people go to the polls is going to be quite important.
But the problem is they're doing well without doing anything at the moment. Doing something, actually, a comparison would be like Theresa May's manifesto. It was all going well until she said what she was going to do, then it all fell apart. So don't blame them. You crack on as you are. You keep building that momentum. But yeah, I agree with you from an administrative perspective. As much as anything, for people like us, I'm getting people all the time saying to me, who do we talk to in Reform? And I'm saying to them, you could presume you go and speak to their only MS in the Senedd, Laura Ann Jones, but she is an MS, but you can't presume that she is in charge of policy. And I wouldn't expect that they're going to be asking her to be driving forward the policy at this stage either. So I'm telling people to go and meet with essentially the leadership team in London at this stage. And that's who I am taking people to meet at this point. We've heard rumours that Mark Reckless was writing the manifesto at one point. I asked someone in Reform, is it Mark Reckless? And they said, definitely not. It's definitely not Mark Reckless. But he is definitely involved. So when there is uncertainty, you get rumour and it fills a void. And I think it's unhelpful for us. But you got to remember that the political parties aren't there for us. They're there for themselves and they're there for, to an extent, the public. They don't need to do what we want them to do, even if we would like them to.
Yeah, no, I was being sort of, I'd like them to put it in place. I think, as it goes back to where we started, I don't think they're going to put a leader or candidates or a policy platform in place until they absolutely have to. Less scrutiny, the better, as far as they're concerned, I think.
And I can guarantee you that if they care a jot about press, which they really, really, really do, the first name they put out there will not be Reckless. So we definitely won't be having that one. Reckless Rights Manifesto will just be an utter shambles in Westminster for Farage. Now, if a podcast is nothing, it is a place where we can keep audio and then play it back when we're totally wrong later down the line. So, Craig, after the Senedd election, will there be any Tories left in Wales?
Yes. Not lots, but there will be some.
And Joe, will there be a Welsh Labour First Minister?
Unlikely.
All right, that's so non-committal, Joe. We'll get you I'm going to ask every week until you say yes. Well, there we go.
To be honest, I'll be party right to go. Of course, there will be.
There we go. That's the clip we want to play back at you right after the election, Joe. Okay. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Craig, and welcome then to Senedd's Sources. The scene has been set for one of the most consequential elections in the history of a Welsh devolution. You can press subscribe on your podcast app, and you can find us to watch on YouTube as well. And we'll drop into your feeds every week with the latest on Welsh politics and policy making. We will not necessarily be in hock to breaking news. We'll have the time and the space to actually think about it, talk about it, and discuss what really does work for Wales. You will not miss a thing. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk with you again next week. Wales's clean energy dividend is growing year on year. The question is, who gets to benefit? Electrify Britain is working to make sure the answer is everyone. With fairer electricity pricing and wider access to clean power, households, businesses and communities across Wales can all share in the energy we're already producing. A fairer, more secure Wales powered by homegrown clean energy is within reach. You can follow at Electrify Britain to learn more.